Sarah Martinez walked into the elite military training facility with her head held high, but inside, her stomach churned with nervous energy. The concrete walls seemed to echo with decades of warrior legends, and she could feel every pair of eyes in the room tracking her movement. At 24, she was one of only 3 women attempting to join this specialized counterterrorism unit, and the weight of that responsibility pressed down on her shoulders like a heavy backpack. The morning sun cast long shadows across the training yard as Sarah adjusted her gear. She had spent 2 years preparing for this moment, running countless miles through muddy terrain, lifting weights until her muscles screamed, and studying tactical manuals until her eyes burned. Her father, a retired Marine, had warned her about what she would face. "They'll test more than your physical strength," he had said, his weathered hands gripping her shoulders. "They'll test your spirit, your determination, and your ability to prove you belong there." Commander Jack stood at the front of the group, his stern gaze sweeping over the 42 candidates who had made it this far. His silver hair was cut military precise, and his uniform bore the marks of someone who had seen real combat. When his eyes landed on Sarah, she noticed a flicker of something she couldn't quite identify. Skepticism, perhaps, or maybe curiosity about whether she could handle what was coming. "Listen up, recruits," barked, his voice carrying across the yard without effort. "Over the next 12 weeks, we're going to break you down and build you back up. Some of you will quit, some of you will fail, and some of you will discover what it truly means to be a warrior. Your gender, your background, your previous achievements mean nothing here. All that matters is whether you can perform when lives depend on it." The first week was brutal in ways Sarah hadn't anticipated. The physical challenges were intense, but she had expected that. What caught her off guard was the constant psychological pressure from some of her fellow candidates. During meal breaks, she would overhear whispered conversations about how she was taking up a spot that should go to a real soldier. When she excelled in hand-to-hand combat training, defeating a man who outweighed her by 60 pounds, someone muttered that it was just luck, and that she would crumble when things got serious. A former Army Ranger with arms like tree trunks seemed particularly determined to make her feel unwelcome. He had a way of positioning himself near her during briefings, making comments just loud enough for her to hear. "Hope she doesn't expect special treatment when we're carrying live ammunition," he would say to his buddies, or wonder how long before she realizes this isn't the place for playing soldier. Sarah's bunkmate, Lisa, was facing similar treatment. Lisa had been a police officer for 6 years before applying for the program, and she had stories that would make most people's hair stand on end. Yet even she struggled with the constant undermining. "Sometimes I wonder if we're fighting 2 battles," Lisa confided one evening as they cleaned their rifles. "One against the course requirements, and another against people who think we don't belong here." The turning point came during the 3rd week, during a particularly challenging obstacle course that required teams to work together. The course included rope climbs, wall scaling, and a series of underground tunnels that tested claustrophobia limits. Sarah found herself paired with 2 other men for the exercise. The goal was simple: navigate the course as a team, with everyone crossing the finish line together or everyone fails. As they approached the first obstacle, a 12-foot wall that required teamwork to overcome, deliberately positioned himself away from Sarah. "You 2 handle that section," he told his other teammates, nodding toward a different part of the course. "We'll take care of the heavy lifting." His message was clear. He didn't trust Sarah to pull her weight, and he wasn't going to risk his own success by depending on her. Sarah felt a flash of anger, but she pushed it down. She had learned early in life that actions spoke louder than arguments. Instead of protesting, she simply nodded and moved toward the section had dismissed as unimportant. What he hadn't realized was that this section included a critical rope and pulley system that would be essential for the final obstacle. As the exercise progressed, Sarah found herself working harder than ever. She wasn't just trying to complete her own tasks. She was trying to excel in a way that would make it impossible for anyone to question her capabilities. When the team reached the final obstacle and realized they needed the rope system Sarah had been working on, they found themselves in a difficult position. The final challenge required the entire team to cross a simulated river using only the materials they had gathered throughout the course. This group had focused on the obvious obstacles, but had overlooked several critical components. Meanwhile, Sarah had methodically collected every piece of equipment that might be useful, including items that seemed insignificant at first glance. "We need that rope configuration you were working on," called out, his voice carrying a note of urgency as the clock continued ticking down. The exercise had a strict time limit, and failure would mean starting over the next day with a mark against their records. Sarah looked at him steadily. She could have made him ask properly, could have demanded an apology for his earlier behavior. Instead, she simply began setting up the rope system with practiced efficiency. "Lisa, grab the anchoring stakes from that pile," she called out, her voice calm and professional. "We'll need them secure before anyone tries to cross." As Sarah worked, her movements quick and confident, the other team members began to take notice. She wasn't just completing the task. She was demonstrating a level of tactical thinking that impressed even the instructors watching from nearby. She had anticipated the team's needs and prepared accordingly, something that spoke to natural leadership instincts. The river crossing required each team member to trust their lives to the rope system Sarah had constructed. One by one, they clipped in and made their way across the rushing water below. When it was turn, he hesitated for just a moment, looking at the woman who had just possibly saved his training prospects. "Nice work on the rigging," he said quietly, just loud enough for her to hear. It wasn't exactly an apology, but it was acknowledgement, and Sarah nodded in response. They completed the obstacle course with just minutes to spare, and as they stood dripping and exhausted on the far side of the river, their instructor approached with his evaluation clipboard. "Solid teamwork," he announced. "Martinez, your preparation and foresight prevented a team failure. That's the kind of thinking we need in the field." That evening, as Sarah sat in the mess hall eating her dinner, she noticed that the whispered comments had decreased somewhat. A few of the men who had been openly skeptical now nodded when she passed by. It was a small victory, but she knew better than to think the battle was over. Commander appeared at her table unexpectedly, his tray of food in hand. "Mind if I sit?" he asked, and Sarah gestured to the empty chair across from her. They ate in silence for a few minutes before he spoke again. "I've been watching your progress," he said, his voice low enough that their conversation wouldn't carry to other tables. "You're performing well, but I can see this environment is testing more than your physical capabilities." Sarah met his gaze directly. "I knew what I was signing up for, sir. The challenge isn't just the training, it's proving that I belong here despite what some people think." Nodded slowly. "I've seen a lot of soldiers come through this program over the years. Some of the strongest men I've known have washed out, not because they lacked physical strength, but because they couldn't handle the mental pressure. What I'm seeing from you is something different. You're not just enduring the pressure, you're using it to become better." He paused, seeming to consider his next words carefully. "There's something you should know. This program isn't just about creating elite soldiers. It's about finding people who can perform under the worst possible circumstances, when everything is going wrong and lives are on the line. Sometimes the person who looks least likely to succeed ends up being exactly who you want watching your back in a firefight." Sarah felt a warmth spread through her chest, but she kept her expression neutral. "I appreciate that, sir, but I'm not looking for special consideration. I just want the chance to prove myself on the same terms as everyone else." "That's exactly what you're getting," replied with what might have been the hint of a smile. "And from what I've seen so far, you're making the most of that chance." As the weeks continued, Sarah found herself settling into a rhythm. The physical demands of the training were intense, but her body was adapting. More importantly, her confidence was growing. She wasn't the strongest candidate in the program, but she was proving to be one of the most consistent. While others had spectacular successes followed by dramatic failures, Sarah maintained a steady level of high performance that earned grudging respect from her peers. The academic portion of the training was equally challenging. They studied everything from foreign languages to explosive ordnance disposal, from battlefield medicine to psychological warfare techniques. Sarah discovered she had a natural aptitude for tactical analysis, often finding creative solutions to complex scenarios that impressed her instructors. One particular exercise involved planning a hypothetical rescue mission in hostile territory. The candidates were divided into small groups and given detailed intelligence reports to analyze. Sarah's group included Lisa, and a quiet former Marine named David who rarely spoke unless he had something important to contribute. As they pored over maps and intelligence reports, Sarah began to see patterns that others were missing. "Look at the timing of these patrol reports," she said, pointing to a series of entries in the intelligence summary. "There's a gap here every day between 1400 and 1430 hours. It's subtle, but it's consistent." Leaned over to look at what she was indicating. Over the past few weeks, his attitude toward both Sarah and Lisa had evolved from open hostility to grudging professional respect. "You're right," he admitted. "That could be a shift change or meal break. Small window, but it might be our best opportunity." Their plan took shape over the next several hours, with each team member contributing their expertise. Sarah's observation about the patrol timing became the foundation for their entire approach, and their final presentation earned praise from the instructors for its attention to detail and realistic assessment of risks. After their presentation, David approached Sarah as they were packing up their materials. "That was sharp thinking," he said quietly. "The kind of thing that saves lives in real operations." Coming from someone with David's reputation for precision and caution, the compliment carried significant weight. But even as Sarah gained acceptance from some of her peers, she knew that bigger challenges lay ahead. The program was designed to push candidates to their absolute limits, and everyone understood that the truly difficult tests were still coming. She had proven she could handle the physical demands and academic requirements, but the final phase would test something deeper: her ability to perform under extreme stress when failure could mean death. As she lay in her bunk that night, listening to the quiet sounds of her fellow candidates settling in for sleep, Sarah thought about her father's words. He had been right about the program testing more than physical strength, but what he hadn't told her was how much she would discover about herself in the process. She wasn't just learning to be a soldier. She was learning what it meant to earn respect through actions rather than demanding it through words. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, and Sarah knew that some of her fellow candidates were still skeptical about her place in the program. But she also knew that she was no longer the uncertain young woman who had walked through the facility doors weeks ago. She was becoming someone who belonged here, someone who had earned her place through dedication and performance rather than just determination and hope. The 8th week of training brought the survival phase, and Sarah knew this would be her greatest test yet. The instructors had transported the remaining 23 candidates to a remote wilderness area where they would spend 10 days with minimal equipment, facing challenges designed to simulate real-world missions behind enemy lines. The morning air was crisp as Commander delivered his final briefing before releasing them into the field. "For the next 10 days, you'll be operating with limited food, basic shelter materials, and communication equipment that you'll only use in genuine emergencies," announced, his breath visible in the cold morning air. "You'll face scenarios designed to test your problem-solving abilities, your physical endurance, and most importantly, your ability to maintain mission focus when everything seems hopeless." Sarah adjusted her pack, feeling the weight of 3 days' worth of food and basic survival gear. The pack seemed impossibly light for a 10-day exercise, which was exactly the point. They would need to find or create everything else they needed to survive while completing a series of objectives that would be revealed throughout the exercise. Lisa stood next to her, looking determined but concerned. Over the past weeks, the two women had developed a strong friendship based on mutual respect and shared challenges. "Whatever happens out there," Lisa said quietly, "we watch each other's backs." The first 3 days pushed everyone to their limits. The candidates were divided into groups of 4 and given coordinates for checkpoints scattered throughout the mountainous terrain. Each checkpoint contained supplies and the next set of instructions, but reaching them required navigation skills, physical endurance, and often creative problem-solving. Sarah's group included Lisa, David, and surprisingly, the former Army Ranger had specifically requested to work with Sarah after her performance in previous exercises. "I want to see what she's really made of," he had told the instructors, though Sarah suspected his motivations were more complex than simple curiosity. Their first major challenge came on the second day when they reached a checkpoint only to find it had been deliberately compromised. The supply cache was empty except for a note explaining that they would need to locate an alternate cache using only a cryptic map reference and compass bearings. The catch was that the alternate location was on the other side of a river that had swollen with recent rain. "The bridge marked on our map is gone," David observed, studying the rushing water through his binoculars. "Probably washed out in the same storm that filled this river." Examined the riverbank, looking for alternatives. "We could try to find a narrower crossing upstream, but that would add at least a day to our timeline. We need those supplies if we're going to complete the rest of the exercise." Sarah had been studying the problem from a different angle. The river was too wide and fast for swimming, and building a raft would take too long and risk their equipment. But she had noticed something that the others had missed. About 50 yards upstream, a large tree had fallen partway across the river, its trunk extending roughly two-thirds of the way to the other side. "What if we could extend that fallen tree?" she suggested. "There are plenty of dead branches in this area. If we could lash together enough material to bridge the remaining gap, we might have a crossing." Lisa looked skeptical. "That's a lot of engineering work, and if it fails, whoever's on the tree when it collapses could be in serious trouble." "True," Sarah acknowledged, "but I think it's our best option. The alternative is failing the exercise or risking hypothermia trying to cross downstream where the water's slower but deeper." They spent the next 4 hours constructing their bridge extension. Sarah took the lead on the engineering aspects, using knowledge from her pre-military construction experience to calculate load distributions and stress points. Contributed his strength for the heavy lifting, while David and Lisa gathered materials and worked on the lashing techniques. The most dangerous part came when someone had to crawl out onto the fallen tree to attach their extension. The trunk was slippery with moisture, and the river rushed loudly below. Without discussion, Sarah began rigging herself with their safety rope. "Wait," said, grabbing her arm. "I should do this. I'm heavier, more stable on unstable surfaces." Sarah looked at him steadily. "With respect, this isn't about strength or weight. It's about precision and balance. I've done construction work on high beams, and I understand how this assembly needs to be attached. If we do it wrong, the whole thing fails." Hesitated, and Sarah could see him struggling with his protective instincts and his growing trust in her judgment. Finally, he nodded. "Okay, but we do this right. Double-check all the knots, and we maintain constant communication." The crossing took 20 minutes of careful, precise movement. Sarah made her way across the slippery trunk, attached the extension assembly, and tested its stability before signaling for the others to follow. When they all stood safely on the far side of the river, clapped her on the shoulder with genuine respect. "That was professional-grade work," he said. "I couldn't have done it better myself." But their celebration was short-lived. The alternate cache contained supplies, but also their most challenging assignment yet. They had 48 hours to locate and extract a simulated hostage from a mock enemy camp defended by instructors playing hostile forces. The camp was located somewhere within a 20-square-mile area, and they would have to find it, develop an assault plan, and execute the mission without being detected. The next day and a half tested every skill they had developed over the previous weeks. They moved through the forest like shadows, using terrain and timing to avoid the instructor patrols that swept the area regularly. Sarah discovered she had a natural talent for reading sign and tracking, often spotting evidence of patrol routes that others missed. "There," she whispered, pointing to a barely visible depression in the soft earth near a creek bed. "Boot print heading northwest. Based on the depth and the way the edges are worn, I'd say this patrol passed through here about 2 hours ago." David examined the track and nodded approvingly. "Good eye. That gives us a window to move through this area without contact." They located the enemy camp just before dawn on their deadline day. It was more sophisticated than they had expected, with multiple defensive positions and guard rotations that seemed genuinely challenging. As they observed from their concealed position, Sarah began to formulate a plan that would use their limited resources most effectively. "The key is timing," she explained to the others as they huddled around her rough map of the camp layout. "There's a shift change at 6:30 hours, and for about 90 seconds, there's a gap in coverage on the north side, but we'll need a distraction to draw attention away from the hostage building." Lisa studied the plan. "It's risky. If the timing is off by even a few seconds, we'll be exposed with no backup plan." "All good plans are risky," replied. "The question is whether this is smart risk or stupid risk. Sarah, walk us through the contingencies." For the next hour, they refined the plan, identifying potential problems and developing responses for each scenario they could imagine. Sarah found herself naturally taking the leadership role, not because she demanded it, but because her tactical analysis was consistently the most thorough and practical. The actual mission execution was both thrilling and terrifying. Everything depended on precise timing and flawless communication. Sarah positioned herself as the primary infiltrator, while the others created the planned distraction and provided security. As she slipped through the gap in the perimeter, her heart pounded so hard she was certain the guards would hear it. The hostage turned out to be Instructor Williams, one of the toughest evaluators in the program. He was bound and positioned in a way that made extraction challenging, but Sarah had anticipated this problem. She had brought a collapsible stretcher made from their emergency blankets and rope, and she had William secured and ready for transport within 3 minutes. The extraction route took them through terrain that required careful navigation while carrying a full-sized person. Sarah had planned the route to minimize exposure, but they still had several tense moments when patrol sounds came closer than expected. At one point, they had to remain motionless for nearly 10 minutes while voices passed within yards of their position. When they finally reached the designated extraction point, they were exhausted but triumphant. Instructor Williams stood up, removed his simulated restraints, and looked at each of them with an expression that might have been approval. "That was textbook infiltration and extraction," he said. "Clean entry, minimal exposure, efficient execution. Martinez, your route planning and contingency preparation were particularly strong." But the exercise wasn't over yet. Their final challenge was to make their way back to base camp without using any roads or marked trails, covering nearly 15 miles of rough terrain while avoiding instructor teams that would be actively hunting for them. The next 18 hours pushed them beyond anything they had previously experienced. They moved primarily at night, navigating by stars and compass through dense forest and rocky terrain. During daylight hours, they concealed themselves and tried to rest, but the constant threat of discovery made real sleep impossible. Sarah found herself drawing on reserves of strength and determination she hadn't known she possessed. When stumbled and twisted his ankle badly enough to affect his mobility, she improvised a support system using their remaining rope and padding. When Lisa became disoriented during a particularly difficult night navigation segment, Sarah calmly guided them back on course using landmark references she had memorized during their earlier passage through the area. "How are you doing this?" David asked during one of their brief rest stops. "You're operating like someone with years of field experience, but you're running on the same lack of sleep and food as the rest of us." Sarah considered the question. "I think it's because I stopped thinking about surviving the exercise and started thinking about completing the mission. When you focus on what needs to be done rather than what you're enduring, the physical discomfort becomes less important." They reached base camp just as the sun was rising on their final day. They were dirty, exhausted, and running on willpower alone, but they had completed every objective within the time limits. As they stood in formation with the other successful teams, Sarah realized that only 14 of the original 42 candidates remained in the program. Commander surveyed the surviving candidates with satisfaction. "You've just completed the most challenging phase of this program," he announced. "Those of you standing here have demonstrated not just physical capability, but the mental toughness and tactical thinking that we need in our most critical missions." His gaze swept over the group and lingered for a moment on Sarah. "Some of you exceeded our expectations in ways that surprised even experienced instructors. You've shown that determination and smart preparation can overcome physical limitations, and that leadership can emerge from unexpected sources." That evening, as Sarah finally had the opportunity to clean up and eat a full meal, she reflected on how much had changed since the beginning of the program. The whispered doubts and skeptical comments had largely disappeared, replaced by genuine respect from her peers and instructors. She had proven herself not through dramatic gestures or confrontational moments, but through consistent performance and reliability under pressure. Approached her table during dinner, his expression serious but respectful. "I owe you an apology," he said without preamble. "When this program started, I thought you were here to prove a point or make a statement. I was wrong. You're here because you belong here, and you've earned that place through performance, not politics." Sarah looked at him steadily. "I appreciate that, but I never needed you to believe in me. I needed the opportunity to prove what I was capable of, and that's what I got." He nodded slowly. "That's exactly the kind of attitude that makes someone dangerous in the field, in the best possible way." As the evening wound down and the candidates prepared for what everyone knew would be the final and most challenging phase of the program, Sarah felt a quiet confidence she had never experienced before. She wasn't just surviving the training, she was excelling at it. She had found her place among warriors not by demanding recognition, but by earning it through actions that spoke louder than any words ever could. The real test, she knew, was still ahead, but she was no longer the uncertain young woman who had walked into the facility months ago. She had become someone who could be trusted with the most critical missions, someone whose judgment and capabilities had been proven under the most demanding circumstances. Whatever challenges awaited in the final phase, she was ready to face them as an equal among the elite warriors she had trained alongside. The final phase of training began with an unexpected announcement that sent ripples of tension through the remaining candidates. Commander stood before the group of 14 survivors, his expression more serious than Sarah had ever seen it. Behind him, several men in civilian clothes observed the proceedings with the careful attention of people who were evaluating rather than simply watching. "Ladies and," began, "what you're about to undertake is not a simulation. Over the next 72 hours, you'll be participating in a real-world operation that has been classified at the highest levels. The skills you've developed, the trust you've built, and the judgment you've demonstrated will all be tested under actual operational conditions." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine that had nothing to do with the morning air. Around her, she could see similar reactions on the faces of her fellow candidates. They had trained for months to reach this point, but the sudden transition from exercise to reality was jarring. "6 hours ago," continued, "a team of aid workers was taken hostage by a terrorist cell operating in a remote region approximately 200 miles from here. The local authorities are overwhelmed, and the terrain makes conventional rescue operations extremely difficult. You will be divided into 3 teams of 4 and 5 members each. One team will be assigned to direct action, one to reconnaissance and intelligence gathering, and one to extraction and support." The civilian observers stepped forward and gestured toward them. "These represent various agencies with operational authority for this mission. They will be monitoring your performance and providing mission-specific intelligence. Make no mistake, this is not an exercise. The lives of innocent people depend on your success." Sarah's mind raced as she processed the implications. Everything they had trained for was about to be put to the ultimate test, but with real consequences for failure. As team assignments were announced, she found herself assigned to the direct action team along with Lisa and 2 other candidates she had grown to respect over the previous months. The briefing that followed was unlike anything they had experienced during training. Satellite imagery, intercepted communications, detailed terrain analysis, and psychological profiles of the known terrorists painted a picture of a complex and dangerous situation. The hostages were being held in a compound built into a mountainside, with multiple defensive positions and escape routes for the captors. "Intelligence indicates that the terrorist cell is planning to move the hostages within the next 48 hours, explained one of the civilian operators, a man who introduced himself only as agent. "If they succeed in relocating to their primary stronghold, rescue becomes exponentially more difficult. This represents our best opportunity for successful extraction." Lisa raised her hand. "Sir, what's the current condition of the hostages? Are they injured, and do we have any recent visual confirmation?" Nodded approvingly at the question. "Latest intelligence suggests all 6 hostages are alive but under significant stress. We have reason to believe that conditions are deteriorating, which adds urgency to the timeline." The next 18 hours were a blur of intensive planning and preparation. Sarah found herself naturally falling into the role of tactical analyst, developing multiple assault options based on the available intelligence. Her methodical approach to problem-solving, which had served her well throughout training, became invaluable as the team worked through scenarios and contingencies. "The primary challenge is the terrain," she explained to her teammates as they studied detailed topographical maps. "The compound is positioned to make direct assault extremely difficult, but that same positioning limits their escape routes. If we can coordinate our timing with the other teams, we can turn their defensive advantage into a tactical weakness." Examined her proposed approach with the careful attention he now gave to all of Sarah's tactical assessments. "It's aggressive, but it's smart. The key will be communication between teams and precise timing on the initial breach." The reconnaissance team, led by David, had been conducting surveillance for 12 hours when they reported back with critical intelligence. "The terrorist cell is smaller than initial estimates suggested," David's voice crackled through their encrypted radio. "We're looking at maybe 8 to 10 individuals total, but they're well-armed and clearly experienced." This information changed everything. Sarah quickly recalculated their approach based on the new intelligence. "Smaller numbers but professional capabilities means we need to prioritize speed and surprise over overwhelming force," she concluded. If we give them time to organize a defense, our advantage disappears. The final mission briefing took place in a temporary command center set up in the pre-dawn darkness. Commander addressed all three teams simultaneously, his voice carrying the weight of real operational authority. "In 4 hours, you will execute this mission," he announced. "Everything you have learned, every skill you have developed, every moment of trust you have built with your teammates will be put to the test. Remember that success is not just about completing your individual tasks. It's about functioning as a coordinated unit where each team's success enables the others." Sarah felt a familiar calm settling over her as the reality of the situation fully registered. This was what she had trained for, what she had endured months of skepticism and challenge to reach. As she checked her equipment one final time, she realized that she no longer felt any trace of the uncertainty that had plagued her during the early weeks of training. The insertion took place in darkness, with each team moving to their assigned positions through terrain that required every navigation skill they had developed. Sarah's direct action team approached their target from the most challenging angle, using a rocky ravine that provided concealment but demanded careful climbing and precise timing. "Alpha team in position," Sarah whispered into her radio as they reached their final staging area. The compound was visible below them, outlined against the dim pre-dawn sky. Lights moved behind windows, indicating that the terrorists were awake and active. "Bravo team in Overwatch position," came David's voice through their earpieces, confirming visual on at least 3 hostiles in defensive positions. "Charlie team standing by for extraction," reported the third team leader. "Route is clear and vehicles are ready." The final moments before the assault stretched out with agonizing tension. Sarah found herself thinking not about the danger or the possibility of failure, but about the innocent people whose lives depended on their success. This was why she had endured the skepticism, the physical challenges, and the constant pressure to prove herself. This moment justified every sacrifice. "All teams execute," came the command, and Sarah's world exploded into controlled chaos. The assault unfolded with a precision that surprised even Sarah herself. Months of training had created instincts and communication patterns that functioned flawlessly under extreme stress. She moved through the compound with her teammates, clearing rooms and securing positions with an efficiency that seemed almost automatic. The terrorists fought back with the desperation of people who knew they were trapped, but their resistance was disorganized and reactive rather than strategic. Sarah found herself in the lead as her team approached the building, where intelligence suggested the hostages were being held. "Contact front," called out as hostile fire erupted from a defensive position near the target building. Sarah immediately assessed the situation and identified a flanking route that would allow them to neutralize the threat without exposing the hostages to crossfire. "Lisa, suppressive fire on my signal," she commanded, her voice calm despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. "I'm going to circle right and take that position from the side." The maneuver required her to cross open ground under potential hostile fire, but Sarah had calculated that the terrorists' position prevented them from covering the approach route she had chosen. She moved with the fluid efficiency that months of training had burned into her muscle memory, reaching the flank position and neutralizing the threat before the terrorists could adjust their defensive posture. "Building secured," she reported as her team regrouped at the entrance to the hostage location, preparing for final entry. The moment when they breached the hostage room would remain burned in Sarah's memory forever. 6 terrified aid workers, bound and clearly traumatized but alive, looked up at their rescuers with expressions of desperate hope. Sarah immediately began organizing their evacuation while her teammates secured the area and established communication with the extraction team. 6 hostages confirmed alive and mobile," she reported. "We need immediate medical evaluation, but everyone appears to be capable of movement to the extraction point." The withdrawal from the compound was as carefully orchestrated as the assault had been. Each team covered the others as they moved through their planned routes, and within 40 minutes of the initial breach, all hostages were safely aboard vehicles heading toward a secure medical facility. As the adrenaline began to fade, Sarah found herself sitting in the back of a military transport vehicle, watching the sunrise paint the mountains in shades of gold and red. Around her, her teammates were experiencing their own versions of the same emotional transition from combat alertness to the realization that they had succeeded in their first real operational mission. Commander appeared at the transport vehicle as they reached the debriefing location. His expression was carefully controlled, but Sarah could see satisfaction in his eyes. "Outstanding work," he said simply. "All objectives achieved, all personnel accounted for, minimal collateral damage. This operation will serve as a model for future missions." The formal debriefing took several hours, with detailed analysis of every aspect of the operation. Sarah found herself answering questions about tactical decisions and leadership moments with a confidence that surprised her. She had functioned not just as a team member, but as a leader whose judgment had been crucial to the mission's success. It was during the final phase of debriefing that the moment Sarah would remember for the rest of her life occurred. Agent, the civilian operator who had provided the initial briefing, approached her with something in his hand. "Martinez," he said, his voice carrying a note of formality that made everyone in the room pay attention. "During the assault phase of this operation, you demonstrated exceptional tactical judgment, leadership under pressure, and combat effectiveness that the highest standards of this unit." He held up a small object that caught the light from the overhead fixtures. "This ring was carried in combat by a Navy SEAL who gave his life in the service of his country. It has been passed down through our community to recognize individuals who embody the warrior spirit and operational excellence that define our most elite units." The room fell completely silent as extended the ring toward Sarah. "It is my honor to present this to you in recognition of your performance today and your potential for future service in our most critical missions." Sarah felt her hand trembling slightly as she accepted the ring. The metal was warm and bore the unmistakable wear marks of someone who had carried it through real combat operations. As she slipped it onto her finger, she looked around the room at the faces of her fellow candidates and instructors. Stepped forward, his expression serious and respectful. "Sarah," he said, and his use of her first name carried more weight than any formal recognition. "When this program started, I thought you were here to make a statement. I was wrong. You weren't here to prove that women could succeed in this program. You were here because you are a warrior, and warriors belong among warriors, regardless of anything else." The room erupted in applause that seemed to echo off the walls with genuine respect and recognition. But what struck Sarah most powerfully was the realization that the skeptical comments and whispered doubts had not just disappeared. They had been replaced by something far more valuable. She had earned the respect of people whose opinions were based on performance rather than prejudice. Later that evening, as Sarah sat alone looking at the ring on her finger, she thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment. She had endured months of physical challenge, psychological pressure, and social skepticism. She had pushed herself beyond limits she hadn't known existed and discovered capabilities she hadn't known she possessed. But the most important discovery had been that respect and recognition could not be demanded or granted as favors. They had to be earned through actions that spoke louder than any words. The ring on her finger was not just a symbol of her success in the program. It was proof that she had become someone who could be trusted with the most critical missions and the most important responsibilities. As she prepared for bed on her final night in the training facility, Sarah reflected on her father's words from what seemed like a lifetime ago. He had told her that the program would test her spirit and determination. What he hadn't told her was that she would discover a version of herself that was stronger, more capable, and more confident than she had ever imagined possible. Tomorrow she would begin her assignment to an operational unit where her gender would be just one characteristic among many, and her value would be measured entirely by her performance and judgment. She was no longer the woman who had walked into the facility months ago hopping to prove she belonged. She had become a warrior who knew beyond any doubt that she had earned her place among the elite, and the ring on her finger was simply recognition of what everyone around her already knew to be true.